This is Lou Agosta, and welcome to A Rumor of Empathy. In this series, we explore whether and to what extent reports of empathy in the community and on the planet are based in fact and in critical thinking or are just mere rumors. Is the rumor of empathy in a given situation or a given interaction sustainable, or is it just a rumor? Today, we explore suicidal empathy. What the heck is that? The short version of suicidal empathy is as follows. We are in a lifeboat which is filled to the maximum after our ship sank. In the water, treading water, surrounding the lifeboat are additional survivors and other leaky lifeboats about to sink, leaving even more survivors treading water. Now, if the survivors in the lifeboat, your boat and my boat, are empathic and take in other survivors treading water, then the lifeboat still afloat will be swamped and we will all drown. The conclusion is that in such extreme situations, which are more common than one might imagine, empathy needs to be turned off or at least dialed down significantly, lest we all perish. This is a thought experiment, a intuition pump designed to generate ideas, insights, and debate about, in this case, empathy and survival. This thought experiment of the lifeboat and its extreme situation has received renewed attention as Elon Musk, remember him? As Elon Musk has notoriously said that empathy is a weakness of Western civilization. Quote, weakness, end quote. Now, to get the URL for the actual soundbite where Musk says that, you have to go to the hard copy version of this podcast on www.empathylessons.com. Or likely you could hit it and the related CNN article by searching on something like Musk says empathy is a weakness of Western civilization. One can always make a splash by throwing a rotten tomato, and those who throw one at empathy get a chance to gather internet clicks by saying something shocking, even if it is of questionable accuracy. I have had empathy advocates tell me that this coverage by Musk and I believe Joe Rogan of empathy falls under the rubric that there is no such thing as bad publicity and one could not buy it at any price. It is almost as good as having one's books banned by the Catholic Church. Sales are up. However, what about seriously engaging this thought, literally as a debating point? Is empathy a weakness? One might say a defect of Western civilization, dooming us to suicide and or suicidal kindness, over generosity, all the way to species extinction? As an exercise in thinking, consider the pros and cons. Thus, returning to the matter at hand, suicidal empathy. Now, you know how modern agriculture can grow enough food to feed everyone on the planet, thanks to green revolution and high yield seeds. But people are still starving. People are starving in war zones. Heck, people are even undernourished and arguably starving in the inner city here in Chicago, where I live. But that's not because of a shortage of food. That's because of the use of food to dominate, control, and manipulate on the part of bad actors, politicians, and politics in the pejorative sense of the word, to perpetrate hostility, aggression, and bad actions. Likewise, enough empathy is available to go around, but it is badly distributed. People are living and working in empathy deserts. Organizational politics, stress and burnout, attempts to control and dominate, egocentrism and narcissism, out and out aggression and greed, all result in empathy getting hoarded locally, creating empathy deserts even amid an adequate supply. Therefore, this approach does not call for more empathy, but rather for expanded empathy. The difference is subtle. Indeed, the 1 minute empathy training consists in driving out, getting rid of, canceling, abolishing, driving out hostility, aggression, bullying, bad behavior, prejudice, politics in the pejorative sense, a long list of negative behaviors not further specified here. And then empathy naturally and spontaneously comes forth. The majority of people want to be empathic and, given half a chance, will behave empathically. Does this mean that would-be empaths and empathically motivated people have become suicidal? Like most thought experiments, the lifeboat scenario is an intuition pump designed to stimulate debate about a difficult and controversial subject, in this case, empathy in situations of scarcity, trauma, and compromised agency. On background, the original formulation of the lifeboat situation and lifeboat ethics is due to ecologist Garrett Hardin, 1974 publication Hardin, whose idea of spaceship Earth envisions that rich and poor nations are in a life or death struggle against one another for limited resources. Now, Hardin was an anti immigration nativist, key term nativist, anti immigration in a nation of immigrants. That is problematic, but we're not going to let it stop us. On further background, Hardin is called out by the Southern Poverty Law Project as giving support to white supremacist groups. But Hardin's many personal limitations, he doesn't actually use the word empathy, but it's easily implied, along with a set of things such as compassion, generosity, kindness, charity. In any case, that his thought experiment of lifeboat ethics nevertheless still has merit. We engage it as a thought experiment on its own merits. Once again, the idea of Hardin's thought experiment is that each nation is a lifeboat. Nations such as the USA and those in the European Union and many other places, those such as the USA are solid and well off, tight lifeboats. Other nations such as South Sudan, Burundi, the Central African Republic, Bangladesh are sinking. In the case of Bangladesh, that is literally true. Or at least these nations and the metaphorical lifeboats are leaking badly. In the water surrounding the lifeboat, there are already a lot of people treading water. Think refugees fleeing hunger and murderous gangs in Central or South America or other places on the planet. And this number of refugees is growing. Therefore, it behooves the well-off nations, the argument goes, to establish strong borders that keep would-be refugees from getting into the lifeboats, overwhelming them, and swamping all of us. According to the scenario of lifeboat ethics, empathy is a luxury we cannot afford. Presumably, something similar could be said about compassion, kindness, generosity, and many of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, Confucius, and Buddha regarding neighborliness. Not affordable luxuries, not affordable in our extreme situation. Now, to engage with the strongest version of lifeboat ethics requires a scenario in which there really is a situation of extreme scarcity. For the sake of argument, Though scarcity is not inevitable, let us suppose that it is indeed inevitable. Let us accept the presupposition, flawed or not, let us accept the presupposition that spaceship Earth has resources which are so limited that extreme measures, hard-heartedness, are required. Accepting the assumption of scarcity, the argument rejects the possibility that human beings have managed to survive on the planet by using their cognitive capabilities, innovating out of predicaments and dilemmas and problems by thinking about the consequences of their actions and finding ways of problem solving, for example, of doing more with less. The ecological authorities who propose the thought experiment of the lifeboat rule out every initiative to lessen the pain and suffering of the participants in the lifeboat scenario, whether in the boat or in the water, thereby eliminating the agency of those who would act empathically. The listener can see what we're doing here, considering various scenarios to address the challenge, the problem proposed by the lifeboat predicament. What do we do? How do we save people who are in distress and in extreme situations? And so, for example, if it is proposed that the people in the lifeboat throw the swimmers their vests or life preservers, think foreign aid, thereby increasing the chances of survival, the authorities rule there are no life vests or not enough life vests. If it is proposed that the people in the boats pull on the oars to circle the boats and use canvas to create a platform to support other survivors, think the United Nations, there are no oars or no canvas, or the seas are too rough. If it is proposed that some good Samaritans in the lifeboat volunteer to treat the lifeboat as a timeshare, think of your ski timeshare in Colorado or Florida, to treat the lifeboat as a timeshare into which and out of which individuals rotate out of the water for a while and then get back in the water, thereby making it possible for more people to survive. Think guest worker program whereby foreigners come to a country, work, earn money, send money home, and then they themselves go back home. The authorities rule the water is so cold as to make such sharing unworkable. If it is proposed that the occupants in the lifeboat pass the survivors in the water a thermos of hot herbal tea, think Doctors Without Borders, thereby delaying hypothermia, the authorities rule there is no such thermos. If it is proposed to implement a flotation device for the person in the water by tying the ends of one's trousers together, capturing the air, and wrapping it around one's shoulders, think the Peace Corps, then the authorities rule the fabric is too thin or torn. If after the people in the water have died of hypothermia or been killed by sharks, the people in the lifeboat can live for hundreds of days on sea turtles, raw fish, and rainwater. Think micro-lending, but only if they have a fishing line and a piece of canvas to capture the rain. The sea is a vast source of protein, and the sea can sustain many lifeboats given a piece of fishing line and a piece of putty to plug a random leak. The authorities rule all that out as well. In short, the agency required to imagine and implement an empathic act is canceled by the steady drumbeat and counter argument of not enough, not enough, not enough, not enough. Scarcity is the rule. Scarcity is the law. Scarcity, scarcity, scarcity. And so, therefore, people are in the lifeboat dilemma. As thinkers of the lifeboat dilemma, we are put into a double bind. If one acts inclusively, thoughtlessly pulling people into the already overcrowded lifeboat, then everybody ends up in the water and eventually under the water. If one acts to repel any attempt to get into the lifeboat by somebody who is trying to self-rescue someone in the water who is trying to climb into the lifeboat, then the person in the lifeboat becomes a perpetrator and acts hard-heartedly, pushing him down, maybe even pushing him or her under the water. Go away, stay away. This is why tragedy, the art form, was invented. Life presents contingent circumstances that constrain one's agency, limits one's choices, and make one both a survivor and a perpetrator, if indeed one survives. One is caught between the rock and the hard place, literally, in this case, between the devil and the deep blue sea. Now, empathize with that. The result is empathic distress, including forms of compassion fatigue and burnout, one and all professional risks of the helping professions. In addition to empathic distress, standard empathy confronts obstacles of emotional contagion, projection, conformity, and communications lost in translation. Empathy itself requires innovation. This occurs in the form of radical empathy, which leverages the imagination to find a way forward in the face of tragic circumstances, challenges, double binds, and so on. Radical empathy is committed to empathizing in the face of empathic distress to solve the dilemma through imaginative variations when and where it is possible to do so, and to comfort the survivor by bearing witness to the tragic struggle where the outcome is a tragic one. When the imagination is constrained to rule out every option except the narrowest, strictest self interest, then the result is a scenario in which pain and suffering are going to be widespread, and people who do not need or deserve to be hurt are going to get hurt. People are starting to wonder if, given the lifeboat scenario, they might indeed be better off in having gone down with the ship. However, this is not caused by or the fault of empathy. It is due to lack of imagination. If we human beings were not empathic, and a small set of related phenomenon, such as compassion, generosity, kindness, and as noted earlier, most of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, then we would not experience conflict, distress, trauma. In short, the breakdown of empathy that occurs in this situation. Now, we will never know for sure whether Garrett Hardin, the innovator, the thinker, who was both a white supremacist and anti-immigration nativist, and the innovator of the lifeboat ethics scenario, we will never know for sure whether Garrett Hardin was overcome by empathic distress or suffered from a clinical depression or both. However, it is generally accepted that he ended his own life by suicide. The first documented case of suicidal empathy. Yet, even in the face of lifeboat ethics, empathy remains indispensable. Empathy has a direct answer to lifeboat ethics and those about to be cast into a lifeboat. Women and children first. That bears repeating. Women and children first. If that happens to be your own spouse and children, so much the better. However, save someone. And while I cannot say what action I would take personally in such an extreme situation, presumably one should be ready under some circumstances, difficult ones to be sure, to surrender one's place in the boat. That is the empathic moment and the answer to hard-hearted proposal to throw the weak overboard. Children are the future, and unless they survive, Species extinction is the guaranteed, not the probable outcome. And that is a completely different thought experiment, not necessarily relevant here. Nevertheless, that is the empathic answer in the case in extremis of the lifeboat dilemma, women and children first. In the face of a thought experiment, such as lifeboat ethics, designed to take away one's power in the face of contingencies, the problem, how to allocate resources empathically in the face of extreme scarcity. This cannot be directly solved. Rather, the problem must be refuted. The setup of the experiment contains a fundamentally flawed proposition. The experiment makes it sound like scarcity is unavoidable. Scarcity is inevitable. And while there are hurricanes and natural disasters, and more problematically, many man made disasters, disasters made by persons and human beings, bad actors of all kinds, scarcity is not inevitable. This is factually, logically, scientifically, and historically accurate. Scarcity is not inevitable. Scarcity, let us consider the example of starvation, is occurring on this planet in war zones and even, as noted, in inner city communities, but not because of lack of food. Starvation, malnutrition, undernutrition, scarcity is occurring because food is being used as a weapon of domination, as a means of control and manipulation, by means of and to further the interests of prejudice, aggression, and war. There is enough food to go around, as we will readily demonstrate in the next conversation, but hostile powers, often governments, often powerful individuals, often powerful organizations, hostile, aggressive powers are withholding the food, withholding the nutrition from those who have been designated as the enemy, including civilian populations. A non-controversial, if no less gut-wrenching example was the Nigerian Biafran Civil War, 1967 to 1970, which are infamous for the many examples and photos of children near death with swollen bellies due to malnutrition. One does not have to go back to 1970 to see that. The conflicts in the Sudan and in other war zones on the planet present similar shocking and empathically distressing evidence. And nevertheless, the malnutrition, the starvation was due to military blockade, not crop failures. Such holding would, of course, be contrary to empathic or even decent and minimally ethical behavior. On background, Spaceship Earth, to use Hardin's incisive term, has vastly more resources than a lifeboat and therefore vastly expanded opportunities for imaginative variation and innovation. To stay for a moment with the example of feeding people, the development of Cyrus McCormick's combine wheat reaper, this would be in the late 19th century, in the Midwest, here in the heartland near Chicago. He was a rich robber baron of capitalism in his mansion in the neighborhood here. In any case, to stay with the example of feeding people and follow up and on agribusiness technology, these innovations in agriculture allow some 2% of the population to grow enough food to feed the other 98%. In effect, the entire planet. And this, in spite of the fact that human choices made under aggression continue to use food as a weapon of domination and starvation. Prior to the Green Revolution, the other 98% of the population had to work 12 to 16 hours a day to grow enough food to avoid a slow, agonizing death by starvation. Now, note, a man named Norman Borlaug, who is not a household common word, Norman Borlaug, Borloug, I'm sending you to Wikipedia on this one. He lived 1914, 2009, passed away 2009. Norman Borlaug, his innovations, he was a scientist and an agriculturalist. His innovations in seeds and plants, and he, I believe, was working in the vicinity of Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. In any case, wherever he was working, his innovations in seeds and plants improved agricultural yields by integral factors, times 2, times 10, leading food experts to estimate Borlaug's innovations saved over 1 billion people from starvation. This earned Borlaug the Nobel Peace Prize because many conflicts occur as one country tries to grab the land of the other country, in addition to national pride, to grow food on it. And he also earned the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom. Garrett Hardin, the other guy, lived long enough to know about this, but his commitment to anti-immigration politics apparently created a blind spot, preventing him from engaging. Therefore, the approach of lifeboat ethics is based on a fallacy that the situation of scarcity is an unavoidable and inevitable contingency. On the contrary, scarcity is being manufactured by bad actors, bad politics, and out aggression. As such, the scarcity can and should be undone by better actors, actors with better, including empathic and ethical motives, in order to restore the community to a benchmark standard of human decency and human functioning. This is, of course, consistent with natural disasters creating local calamities that cause scarcity. It is also consistent with disagreements about what constitutes an emergency. However, the point is to send in emergency services and the National Guard to deliver pallets of drinkable water, tents, provisions, putty to stick into the leaks in the lifeboat, and related provisions, not to shoot the survivors as a burden to the community, the latter following the logic of the lifeboat to its absurd conclusion. Returning to the basic metaphor, empathy is no more to blame for overloading the lifeboat than carpentry is to blame for the fact that Roman soldiers used hammers and nails to execute condemned criminals and political enemies by crucifying them. Without practice, without good judgment, empathy can go astray, as can any other human cognitive and emotional capability. Empathy can go astray as emotional contagion, projection, conformity, communications that get lost in translation. With practice, key term, practice, a rigorous and critical empathy sets boundaries, establishes limits, and creates a whole that is more than the sum of its parts. Empathy belongs to a short list of things such as dignity, respect, neighborliness, and forms of spiritual affection and affinity and love that are not quantifiable as zero-sum phenomenon. For example, if I give you a piece of my chocolate cake, I have less cake. But if I give you empathy by giving you a good listening, we both have expanded empathy. You feel heard, and I have the satisfaction of a humanizing encounter in which my own humanity is enriched in contributing to another person. Rigorous and critical empathy is not quantifiable like chocolate cake. Like food, there is enough empathy to go around, but it does not seem that way because we have not been effective in driving out the obstacles to empathy, such as aggression, hostility, bullying, and politics in the pejorative sense. Now, I acknowledge this is a difficult, significant, and serious conversation. It does not mean that we cannot enjoy a lighter moment. So I do wish to assert that while there is no scarcity if you add up all the available food, in the matter of basic foods, there is a scarcity in the matter of chocolate cake. The world does need more chocolate cake. Now, if I have to explain the joke, it's not funny. Returning to our main topic here, Lord Acton Lord Acton, he was a British peer and more, famously said, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Granted that leaders lacking integrity engage in abuses of power, this is not new news. That super rich individuals and corporations form alliances with powerful politicians is called a lot of things. Oligarchy, for one, is defined as the rule of the rich for the benefit of the rich. Fascism is defined as the rule of a military industrial complex pulling the strings of dependent politicians, dependent on what? One guess, the money of the corporations at the expense of individuals and their liberties. A new trail of tears comes forth based on fear and intimidation. The political authorities argue the current situation is an emergency, an invasion, a crisis that requires setting aside the standard rule of law. An early version of capitalism that rejects win win participation and business innovation is privileged over creating a clearing for a rising tide, which raises all boats. That, by the way, is a soundbite from Ronald Reagan. A rising tide raises all boats, and it continues to riff on the lifeboat theme. It's hard not to get cynical. Setting aside the rule of law, what? So that the president can accept $400 million gifts from a foreign power in direct violation of the US Constitution, word of the day, it's called the Emoluments Clause. Granted, this is a single example, a strange emergency indeed. In the face of this, empathy proposes to speak truth to power, changing the metaphor. While bureaucracy may indeed need to be trimmed back from time to time, think of forest management that burns the underbrush with a controlled burn, lest it spawn an even bigger forest fire that burns down the entire nearby city. What we are now seeing, May 23rd, 2025, is an uncontrolled burn. Entire governmental administrative departments serving the citizens are summarily laid waste, jeopardizing emergency responses to tornadoes, hurricanes, national security, scientific innovation, foreign aid to allies and would be friends, basic education, business entrepreneurship. The list goes on. Key term: uncontrolled burn. I call out and credit Garrett Smith for calling my attention to this. It has happened that a controlled burn, we're talking forest management, got out of hand and resulted in a major forest fire. However, this is now a description of the so called Department of Government Efficiency, pronounced DAWG, DAWG, approach to cost cutting, uncontrolled burn. My take, who else's would it be, is that cost cutting wizards are undertaking an uncontrolled burn. Think slash and burn. We conclude with a positive proposal: teach critical thinking. This is an empathic educational moment. Absent a rigorous and critical practice of empathy, I'm cautious and reluctant to engage current political cliches, even acknowledging that I have just done so, in a highly polarized political world and rhetoric in the negative sense. Critical thinking includes putting oneself in the place of one's opponent, not necessarily to agree with the other individual, but to consider what advantages and disadvantages are included in the opponent's position. Take a walk in the other person's shoes after having first taken off one's own to avoid the risk of projection. Show one where the shoe pinches. The pinching, to stay with the metaphor, is not mere knowledge, but a basic experience and inquiry into what the other considers possible based on how the other's world is disclosed experientially. That is what we have attempted to do here by engaging with the most rigorous version of the lifeboat dilemma instead of a straw man. Critical thinking is a possibility and an intuition pump designed to get people to start listening to one another, allowing the empathic receptivity and listening to come forth. Returning again to our intuition prompt, and as noted, even in the face of lifeboat ethics, empathy remains indispensable. How so? If one is in a lifeboat, one is by definition a survivor. Your ship sank. That is a necessary part of the definition of a lifeboat. You were cast into the vast, seemingly boundless sea. Never underestimate the importance of empathy for those in extremis, those in extreme situations. But even more than empathy, the occupants of a lifeboat need rescue. Key term, rescue. To be in a lifeboat and not need rescue is a contradiction in terms, blowing up the whole scenario and sending it back to the drawing board. This might be quite appropriate. Nevertheless, this exposes the entire lifeboat scenario as a manipulation and mechanism for constraining, compromising, and denying agency, the ability to freely choose, to the participants in the lifeboat and in the lifeboat dilemma. However, let us once again, out of an abundance of intellectual cognitive charity, take the lifeboat scenario at face value. Help is not coming. So here we sit, awaiting rescue, knowing or not knowing that help is not coming. However one wants to describe it, we are at risk of becoming perpetrators, albeit unwillingly, if we defend the lifeboat against those trying to climb into it by pushing them back down into the water. People are going to drown. In most tragic literature, we're thinking Greek tragedy, Shakespeare, all those other guys, even modern tragedies, Death of a Salesman. Think of that one. In most tragic literature, the protagonist is both a survivor and a perpetrator. For example, the Greek hero, Oedipus, was exposed as an infant to die, abandoned by his biological parents who feared the prophecy. Get this, they're somewhat delusional, but in those days it was okay. They feared the prophecy that the baby would grow up to murder his father. Therefore, he's abandoned, exposed, put on the side of a mountain. He is rescued by a shepherd, and he goes on unwittingly to kill his biological father in an altercation and dispute as he, Oedipus, the fated prophecy, leaves the home of his foster parents, not realizing they have fostered him. Likewise, the people in the lifeboat are both survivors and perpetrators. The latter, as they have to take violent action to defend their boat against the desperate swimmers who would occupy. Two wrongs do not make a right, and there is no excuse for bad behavior. None will be advocated here. However, the people in the lifeboat are asked to make choices, life and death decisions that no one is entitled to make, that no one should have to make, indeed, that no one can make with integrity, yet that they do indeed make anyway, and in any case, they make decisions since doing nothing is also a choice. The point is not to marshal excuses, since there are none adequate to life and death, but to note that standard empathy is challenged in the face of what amounts to moral trauma, caught between a rock and a hard place, caught in a double bind, caught, as we noted earlier, literally between the deep blue sea and the devil. Standard empathy is challenged in the face of moral trauma to become radical empathy. Now, as already noted, the value of engaging with a thought experiment, such as lifeboat ethics, is that empathy itself is not a static thing once and for all. The proposal is that the lifeboat dilemma calls for and calls forth radical empathy. Radical empathy leverages the imagination to find a way forward in the face of tragic circumstances. Radical empathy is committed to empathizing in the face of empathic distress in order to solve the given dilemma through imaginative variations when and where it is possible to do so. Throw him your life preserver, throw him your life vest, an example. And to comfort the survivors when there are any, and when there are no survivors, by bearing witness to the tragic struggle where the outcome is a tragic one. A rigorous and critical empathy, whether standard or radical, creates a safe zone of acceptance and tolerance within which people can inquire into what is possible, in which people can debate and listen to a wide spectrum of ideas, positions, feelings, and expressions out of which new possibilities can come forth. For example, empathy and critical thinking support and maintain firm boundaries and limits against actors who would misuse social media to amplify and distort communications. Much of what, once again, for example, Jürgen Habermas says about communicative distortions in mass media, television, and film also applies with a multiplicative effect to the problematic, if not toxic, politics occurring on the internet and social networking. The extension to issues of politics, climate change, and community struggles of all kind follows immediately. Insofar as individuals skeptical of empathy are trying to force a choice, trying to force a decision between critical thinking and empathy, the choice must be declined. Both empathy and critical thinking are needed. Hence, a rigorous and critical empathy is included in the definition of enlarged critical thinking, and vice versa. In conclusion, a positive alternative to abandoning facts and skipping critical thinking is suggested by Bob Dylan's song about empathy. Oh, you didn't know he had one? Here it is. One has to push off the shore of certainty and venture forth into the unknown. We give Dylan the last word. 1965, quote, "I wish that for just one time you could stand inside my shoes, and for just one moment I could be you."